Thank you very much. I appreciate that introduction. It's exactly as my mother would have written it, I think. But I must say that the remarks I'm going to make on my own, they have no way reflect the policy or attitudes of the Southern Center for International Studies. But what I would like to do is take a minute. How many of you may have attended the Secretaries of State conference we did in April? Was anybody there, actually? This was a very interesting program. This is the 16th we've done with the former U.S. Secretaries of State. It was held at the University of Georgia in Athens to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Dean Rusk Center. Mr. Rusk was a chairman of the Southern Center for many years and was involved in these conferences at the beginning. The program was very well attended, as was mentioned. And I think, just as an observer of many of these audiences through the years, because these are, in fact, television productions, we actually produce and edit our own television. And this particular program, a one-hour version of it, we've edited, and it will be seen on PBS Channel 30 here in Atlanta on, I think, the 16th of November. But it was interesting for me because the university scheduled the event in the Classic Center, which is a 2,200-seat facility, a gorgeous facility, and they said, well, there might be 500 or 600 people there. Well, as Charles had mentioned, it was sold out more than a month before the program was ever held. And in sitting in the audience, I observed not just a really large variety of people, but people from all over the state. These were not just local people from Clark County. These men and women, teachers and students in many cases, had driven from Savannah and Statesboro, people from Bainbridge. So they had to get up early in the morning to get there, and it started at 10:30, so you can just imagine the travel involved. And the intensity of the audience was also quite stunning to see how those 2,200 people sat there and never moved. I mean, it was total involvement, which I think gives me great encouragement, because I think it's a myth to believe that Americans are not interested in foreign policy. I think they get not enough opportunities to learn about it, starting in school, and certainly the media doesn't help any. But when given the opportunity, they do get very interested, and in this case, sacrifice to be there. The secretaries were asked to suggest a foreign policy agenda for the next administration. We had 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. We had Henry Kissinger, James Baker, Colin Powell, Madeleine Albright, and Warren Christopher. We do not pay these people. They come, we provide a lot of airplanes, but which we beg, borrow, and steal from people. Not steal, but we do borrow. And they come and they do this with great enthusiasm. Actually, several remarked that, we don't believe we're all here, because normally 1 or 2 of us might get together. But to come to Athens, Georgia, and have all 5 there, I think they were surprised, as lots of people in the audience. The comments of the secretaries were illuminating. From my opinion, we had 2 hours of common sense coming from these men and women. There was very little disagreement as to policy and to changes that should be made by the government of the United States. One of the first questions had to do with the image of the United States overseas, and all agreed that 50% of the people in the world really believe that we're the enemy, we're the dangerous party. Some of the secretaries added that, well, of course, there's still a great legacy, which I think is true, in favor of the United States, and pointed out that every embassy in the world has a line outside of people trying to get a visa to come here. So obviously that is true, but in many cases, because of policy, we're no longer holding the enviable position we used to have in the world as a recognized leader. They all agreed on that, and it was interesting when asked the question, what would you do as sort of step number 1 to remedy this? They all said the same thing: close Guantanamo Bay. So you see people beginning to realize that this is something that has to be handled. They were asked, what about the role of the president in the world? What's going to happen there? And clearly all of them said more or less the same thing. The President of the United States has got to begin to get involved in world issues, especially those transnational issues for example, climate change. It's interesting that just yesterday, Senator McCain made a major speech on this very subject, saying how this is going to be one of the priorities of administration. So it's beginning to seep into the consciousness, I think, of the candidates. But these are the issues that have to be dealt with. They also talked in terms of the need to deal with international issues relating to health. And of course, you see a variation of that today, both in China and the unfortunate situation in Myanmar, where you have a very rigid government that won't even allow the participation of outside nations in helping to resolve a question that's of huge humanitarian proportions. The president of CARE mentioned the other day that they've got 500 people in Myanmar. They're all bottled up in the two major cities. They're not out in the country, and they have already pretty much classified this as one of the greatest disasters of our time. We do not know the full dimensions yet, and we're now, I think, 11 days since the event. So these are the kinds of things that future presidents are going to have to get involved in, and they're going to have to join a team in order to solve some of these issues. Going through the various problems that the president will have, the future president will have to solve, you know, starting with obviously the major issue which people think of is Iraq and the Middle East. There was consensus again on the need to not just talk to your friends. You don't make peace by talking to your friends. You talk to your enemies, and that doesn't mean you enter into negotiations. You might get into a conversation. The solution for Iraq lies in the neighborhood. The neighbors have got to be brought in and talk to them unconditionally. You've got to recognize that, you know, up until 2003, Mr. Baker said we were talking to the Syrians. So if you have Hezbollah in Lebanon causing trouble, it might be a good idea, and they're sponsored by Syria, it might be a good idea to go to Damascus and start a conversation if you want to solve that problem. These are not issues that are going to be dealt with by the 82nd Airborne or any military force. These are political, non-military issues, and as a matter of fact, the parties involved on the periphery have a great deal at stake in these questions, because the Iranians certainly don't want an unstable Iraq in the future. And when you talked about Iran, it was made perfectly clear that there are many factions. There's a Khomeini factor, there's a Rafsanjani factor, there's the government. There is a huge middle class of very, very unhappy people in that country. The economy is not doing well. Oil production is down. Corruption is rife. So I think that there are opportunities there, but you have to begin a conversation. It was also pointed out, which I thought was of some significant interest, that you don't go and talk to the Iranians on a unilateral basis, because you have to bring into the conversation the Gulf states. Because if they're excluded, then it looks to them that, and it appears that way to the people in Tehran, that it's the United States and Iran talking at the exclusion of these other parties. And yet the Gulf states are very important, and they need to be brought in at the very beginning as participants in this. This is not something, again, the United States does unilaterally. Again, the issue was the Cold War is over. We can't act in 2008 like we used to act in the 1950s and 60s. And it's a very, very different world, and we have to participate with people. In terms of the most dangerous place facing the President of the United States, the agreement was that it's Pakistan. Because as Madeleine Albright said, this is international migraine headache number one. It's a country poverty-ridden, corrupt, with a nuclear weapon. And here again, it was pointed out that the solution is in the neighborhood, because you don't want to have Taliban or Al-Qaeda operations in that country stirring up Islamic fundamentalism, because in the neighborhood, that's not a healthy thing. For example, the Indians have 134 million Islamic people in their society. And, you know, they're just across the border. In terms of Russia, which is not thought of as an Islamic country, but there are almost 40 million Islamic peoples there, and a population of less than 140 million, which is declining. At least the European Russians are declining in population. So obviously there's some vested interest there. So when you're talking to people about Afghanistan, you bring in the neighbors. Again, these are very old problems, and the solutions are best found in a joint operation, not a unilateral one. It was pointed out, for example, that you need the Russians and the Chinese in other areas. They might not be your best friends, but they need not be your enemies. For example, a very serious place in this world has been and continues to be for the United States is Northeast Asia and Korea. Well, they were on our axis of evil list, so we weren't talking to the North Koreans. The six-party talks were really provoked by the Chinese, because the Chinese obviously have a #1 interest in developing their economy and not playing host to disadvantaged North Koreans coming across the frontier to add to the other millions of Koreans who already live in China should the Korean economy collapse. So you've got, again, interlocking interests there. The Russians have a similar interest in stability in Northeast Asia. And in fact, if there's a deal to be made with the North Koreans, it's been provoked primarily by the Chinese, with us going along, and with the support of the Russians and the Japanese, the South Koreans as well. So the future that began to emerge is one that's a lot different than what we've experienced in the past, and that there has to be a change in attitude. The Cold War ideas need to be banished, and the new objective of the United States should not be the spreading of democracy. What we're interested in, the secretaries agreed, was the spreading of stability. I mean, again, enlightened self-interest, pragmatic reasons. So as you go through the list of problems, that's what kept coming up. It's the idea of common sense solutions based on innovative, creative thinking and applying lessons from the past. For example, they talked at some length, obviously, about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And clearly, we're not talking to one side because they will not accept the existence of the State of Israel. Well, Secretary Baker said, well, look, I never met Yasser Arafat. We couldn't talk to the PLO. What we did was identified people in the Palestinian community who had credibility and contacts with the PLO and who were talking to the PLO, and we talked to them with the knowledge of the Israelis, and we got a deal. And he said, that's the way you have to operate. So it's that sort of spirit that permeated the entire 2-hour period, and it was enlightened, it was pragmatic, it was not unlike the kind of conversation you probably get from your spouse when she or he reads the paper in the morning and says, what is wrong with these people? Why don't they do something practical? Because that's what they were talking about, practical, common sense solutions to relatively complex problems. But again, it requires the ability to not preach the gospel, you see, but to get down and understand what it's like to be in the other man's shoes, to understand his history, culture, religion, economics, even geography, because these are all factors. And so that was, to me, encouraging. I think that we perhaps will see more of that. On the issue of U.S. military presence in Iraq, it was clear that this is unsustainable. We cannot continue. We do not have the force levels. The military is being slowly but surely, especially the Army and the Marine Corps, worn down. And unless there's some sort of a change, a radical one, in the way military forces are recruited, we cannot sustain that operation. And we'll see next year. It's not been announced, but I understand that the Georgia National Guard, who sent about 2,500 troops to Iraq last year, is now getting ready, they're on alert to go and send that many to Afghanistan next year. Well, this is sort of getting to be old stuff. And how long can you take this, and how long can the military tolerate it? And the answer is probably not for a very long period of time, because by every measure, things with the U.S. Army are not well. Suicides are at an all-time high. Family divorces are at an all-time high. You can now join the Army at age 41. There are 1,600 felons now serving in the Army of the United States. The list goes on, and that's not a sustainable situation for an Army representing, the world's greatest democracy. So it was a pragmatic sort of situation. In terms of China, of course, Henry Kissinger was sitting there, and he started it all, and he was applauded by the other secretaries, and everybody acknowledged that this is possibly the most successful U.S. foreign policy initiative of the modern era, because there's been very little change in our relationships with the Chinese. Because of the elections on Taiwan, the 22nd of last month, and everything in the world changes. In the beginning, when I first started, the Kuomintang were the anti-communist leaders of Asia. These are the people who had a legislature that was still designed to go back and take over the provinces of China, and they had representatives sitting there. Some of you may remember that, ready to take on that task. Very unrealistic, but that's the way it was. Well, now the political darlings of the Chinese in Beijing is the KMT. And so fortunately, I think for the situation, independence is now gone from the Taiwanese agenda, and the message now is cooperation, because both sides are interested in what? Economic development. They don't want to have, they want a jaw, not war. And so the situation on the Taiwan Straits, which would involve the United States should there be hostilities, has now been cooled significantly. And frankly, the secretaries, led by Colin Powell, who should know about some of these things, said he's not even aware. He could not put together a scenario which would see us in a military confrontation with the Chinese. They're increasing their military budget, but you've got to remember the Chinese military, up until recent times, within the last decade, was one of the largest infantry forces in the world, designed to fight in Korea in 1950. So, they've bought a lot of equipment and they've devoted a lot of time and training, but one does not launch an aircraft carrier on Monday and fly effective airstrikes from it on Wednesday, because there's a lot of modern technology that gets in the way of doing that sort of thing. So I think that was a very interesting observation on the part of the secretaries. But you get the picture. You see what evolved there. And I think that as time goes on, we may well begin to see some of these ideas surfacing in the campaign. They have not really as yet. I mentioned just yesterday McCain talked in terms of global warming and climate change, which I think is an interesting concept. We may hear more about that. So it was I think a worthwhile exercise. The program I think will be of some value in its DVD format, and we're planning on circulating it pretty widely to those who are interested in these issues. But I could go on and on and on in this subject. You may have some questions as far as some of those comments. Yes, ma'am.
Are there any conversations about our own neighbors in the Americas?
About what?
Central America and South America?
No, this was one of the things that disappointed us. We really didn't get into the Latin American issue, and we had great questions on that issue, as you might expect. Especially, Venezuela, the economic situation, and now Argentina. Of course, you can talk all day about the possibility of energy independence in Brazil. Not that they don't have it already, but they've now obviously think they've got some major petrochemical finds in the deep water off their coast. So there are all kinds of interesting issues there. Some of them positive and some of them rather negative. Nationalization of industries, things aren't going well in some of the Andean countries for obvious reasons. So we didn't really get into the Latin American issue. Yes, sir.
Anything on Cuba at all, I guess, Latin America?
Well, I think, again, you apply the rule of stability, and you begin to see, what are we accomplishing down there? And maybe nothing's going to change until, Raul passes away and Fidel leaves. But as long as you don't have bellicose conversation coming from Washington, you can't do anything but improve the situation down there. I mean, if any of you have been to Cuba, it's a trip right back to 1950. If you've never been to 1950, you need to go to Cuba. When was the last time you not thought about but rode in a Hudson Hornet? I mean, most of you never even, they think that's a flying animal or insect. It's an automobile, which used to be a very large one. So, eventually, with this kind of attitude, you could project some possibility of change. Yes, sir.
I'd like to return to this. You just touched on it just briefly, but the idea of energy, if you look at that as the common denominator for what's going on in the world, was any argument made or put forward about a consideration of what this means, why we're in Iraq, why Venezuela, why what's going on? Did they discuss that at all?
Well, that's a kind of a non-starter because it's obvious that we're totally dependent on oil, and therefore that's been a driving factor in motivating our actions. And the mention was made that that as long as we're dependent on petroleum products, that we're going to have to be involved in some of these areas. And if we're going to be involved, let's try to make the situation stable so that we can guarantee supplies. I mean, that's the general tone. There is no energy policy in the United States, and that was a sort of an underlying theme that was not really expanded upon, but that was basically what they were. I know.
Anybody proper, any type of
Plan?
Plan or something?
No, they were talking mostly about the details of foreign policy and how you get around, you handle issues like that. The problem is that all that has to happen is for a dissident group in the Niger Delta to kidnap one Italian oil worker, or as happened just last week, a Scottish power plant crew went on strike over a retirement issue, and that shut down the heating system for the North Sea oil, and there was an immediate effect in terms of the oil markets. So those things are, I mean, we're on a very, very tight rein here, and there isn't a lot of surplus. The important thing they talked about Russia, the important thing about Russia is that, and they're hopeful that the new administration will now try to handle the corruption and the United States will have a better relationship with them, maybe not as a close friend, but again as a partner, because the Russians have got serious internal problems. They've got lots of mineral resources, but they haven't invested in infrastructure and exploration. So, as late as a year ago, last December, for other reasons possibly, but he made the statement, the minerals minister of Russia announced that within a decade the Russians would be out of oil, gas, coal, silver, uranium, all of the above, not because they didn't have it, but because they weren't doing exploration. And now, of course, they're still living on Soviet-era infrastructure. They cannot, last winter and the winter before, they were not able to provide adequate gas resources to the city of, some sections of the city of Moscow, because they had to meet overseas contracts. And that's very significant. Oil production, in fact, is down in Russia. The oil minister said just the other day that they were not going to be able to get beyond the 9.2 million barrels. Soviets were producing 10. And it's not because they don't have it, but it's because they don't have the systems in place to develop it. And they're taking advantage of the old oil fields. You see, they're tapping out these areas, and it's more difficult. And a lot of the petroleum that's available to them, or they think is available, and probably is, are in areas where you have inclement weather or deep depths, you see, and they don't have the technology. They need the outside investment to do that, and yet because they've done things like they had a big deal with Sakhalin Island and British Petroleum, where they basically bought out BP at a loss to BP, and they've discouraged, foreign investors going in there. But see, a lot of those things can change, and the hope is that with a new man coming in there, that you'll have some new opportunities. And again, so much of this is personal diplomacy on the part of the President of the United States, you see. Yes, ma'am.
Did Colin Powell give, my mother had a husband morning, and may have had two. Great one. Did Colin Powell give any indication as to who was driving the no talk to the enemies policy? Was it Cheney, Rumsfeld, or Bush himself?
Well, that's a good question. The answer is no, he didn't. But I think we've all read a lot about who really is doing the driving. It's probably was Rumsfeld and Cheney to a large measure, and the president may just have been reacting. So one thing that about this administration apparently is there is not a lot of time for deliberations, in terms of the conducting of meetings and that sort of thing. This came out at this seminar we had the other day. It's not like Bill Clinton where they'd have protracted, colloquium on a particular subject. This is a sort of a cut and dry, black and white kind of thing.
Do you think he'd come out before the election?
Oh, I don't know. I think they agreed that the Iraqi policy is a failure. So that speaks volumes right there. And what they said about that is that in the future, the United States is going to have to start thinking ahead. You don't just take a rash act without figuring out what the implications are, or in Iraq's case, what's the exit strategy. So, these things were discussed, but they were never really seriously considered, I guess, in the White House level. Yes, sir.
Just one question in terms of the global population of the world. The other day I was just taking a look at this global got my attention that the population of the world was about 2.5 billion in 1950. And now it's about 3 times more. It's about 6.5 or something. And in the next years to come, I think it will be 9 billion. If you look at the history of humankind, until 1950 we're 2.5 billion. In 50 years, we are now 6 billion and going to 9 billion. And all the implication of this growth of the population that is out of control in terms of the people who are growing more located in Africa. And the implication not only in the composition of the world in terms of the people who are living, we are living here, but also in the demanding of the resources. And if this earth will be sustainable for the years to come. I don't know what your reflection.
Well, this is, I think, called the Malthusian theory. Well, these things are projections, and you have to look at where's the population growth. For example, the Chinese, who are heralded as the next great economic power of the world, by 2050 will be the second oldest population in the world. Their population is going to start tapering off fairly soon, and for a number of reasons. One, the one-child policies, which is rigorously enforced. Two, middle-class people, as they become more affluent, tend to have fewer and fewer children, and this is showing up already. Places like Singapore, for example, are a glaring example of this. The third issue is the preference in some of these cultures for male children. So you have a declining number of females in some of these populations, and China is suffering from all of these things. The only country in the industrial world, to look at the other end of it, that will have an increase in population by the year 2050 is the United States of America. And the average age here will be something like late 30s. The average age in Europe will be late 50s. 20% of the population of Shanghai is now over 60. So they're getting old. Now, the growth in population is really in those southern hemisphere countries, in Africa, for example, and some of the Islamic countries in Asia. And now, what happens there is really related to the economy, because as you improve the economic circumstances, the educational level of especially women, the populations tend to go down. So if the world comes to, and this is a transnational issue, this is where you get to. So what do you do when you look out on the world at these numbers and you see what the possible consequences are? Well, this is not an answer that's going to be presented by the United States, but by a collective of enlightened leaders who see the long-term possibilities here. I mean, you're courting disaster because, as you say, there are limits on natural resources to handle even. Look at the food shortages we're undergoing now. The world food crisis that's a very serious problem for a lot of reasons. So these are transnational issues that can be, and the solutions are very often common sense. Educate women, improve the economy, improve the health of children, so you don't have to have 5 children hoping that 2 will survive to help you in your old age. These are issues for the industrial world, and when you talk about putting together coalitions, take a look at the coalitions that you could naturally put together. 70% of the total investment of the Europeans last year is in North America. 70% of the $330 billion we invested overseas was in Europe. Europe now is an association of 27 democratically elected free market economies. Almost 500 million people live in Europe. They're not all old. A lot of them are young and very dynamic. Over 22% of the world's GNP. If you look at the United States, it's 20% or plus of the world's GNP. But when you look at the United States in the future, you're going to have to look at North America. Canada and Mexico are part of that mix. Canada is now the largest provider of oil to the United States. It's the 3rd major producer of diamonds in the world. They were the largest investor in the United States last year. There were $430-some-odd billion invested in the United States. The #1 investor was Canada, $60 billion. British was second. The third, Australia, $30 billion. So it's a matter of putting those enlightened, democratic, market-oriented, very often economies together in coalitions. The Chinese obviously have a concern about population getting out of control. The Chinese are not self-sufficient in food, they have to import it. Well, if they have to compete with a lot of starving Africans or Indians, you got a problem, or you got motivation. So in those terms, there are solutions. The solutions are known and well researched. It takes leadership, and this is what I think the secretaries were talking about. These are the transnational issues that we have got to deal with in the future, and this is something which is going to be critical for the survival of us all, because we've got a lot to lose, and the United States, the President of the United States, has sufficient prestige, no matter who he or she is, to reignite that. They can do some things. Initially, there'll be great enthusiasm. If you elect on the Democratic side a person of color or a woman, that's of some great significance. Senator McCain is something else. I don't know. But there are things that can happen in this election that can temporarily change the image of the United States, and that's going to be important. And depending upon how that president plays that role, I think could be very significant in the future of the world. Because the economy of the United States is underestimated. I don't think we understand how big this is. Talk about trade deficits, which are serious, and savings rates, which are not very good. But at the same time, I talked about the investment of people from overseas in North America. $430 billion. That's a vote of confidence from somebody. But at the same time, we're investing 300 and some odd billion overseas ourselves. Now that's significant. If you look at the amount of profit earned by American companies doing business overseas, not doing business in the United States, last year it was over $500 billion. That's a lot of money. Overseas holdings, private holdings of something like $12 trillion. So there's a lot of power out there, and it's a matter of how you mobilize it with your friends and allies who have similar objectives to solve problems like this. Kind of a long-winded answer to a question, but it's a lousy question. I didn't know that. Yes, sir.
Peter, was there any discussion of free trade since leading competitors seem to want to do away with it?
There wasn't, but again, implied in the remarks that were made is that there's got to be a more enlightened policy toward trade. You know, you got to welcome the Russians and the Chinese into the World Trade Organization. You know, you cannot exclude these people. They're big economies. They're major players now. They have major natural resources to offer to the world. They're consumers, and so, you know, again, get your enemies inside the tent so you can talk to them. You may not agree with them, but there's mutual self-interest. Again, the Chinese in Korea, you know, they led the parade. That's a serious place for us in the world, and we were doing nothing, but they led the charge, and now we may have some agreement. Yes.
You emphasized the consensus among the secretaries. What were some of the main points of disagreement or different emphases on?
There really wasn't. It was really a kind of a strange situation there, because these are people, you know, who represent us at both parties, but, you know, they all said also in terms of don't necessarily believe the rhetoric of the campaign, you know, because when they walk in the office, the Oval Office, and the door closes, it's a different situation. So I think there was, you know, there wasn't a lot of diversity of opinion. I think these are solid people who've had a lot of experience, who've been in these areas, they've seen what works, they know what doesn't work. Why reinvent the wheel kind of thing? It was practical, hard-headed, common sense, you know, stability. That's the game. And if you substitute that for what we've got, all the policies changed.
Time for one more question, Stuart.
I was just going to ask you, all these issues that have been brought up, from health to hunger, poverty, food, hunger, all these issues seem to require transnational solutions. And we don't have a big history of that in this country. We don't have a lot of cooperative history with other countries who seem to go out, find a country, blow it up, and then come back and hide. Do you see that being a big issue of changing government? I don't think that even sometimes when the government itself want to do the right thing in that sense, they have a very difficult time of putting the rest of the population together to get behind it. So I'm cynical about that future.
Well, I think you're well advised to think that way, but you know, I was a child during the Second World War. I can remember growing up during that period after the war. And when the Second World War ended, the mothers of America, as one, said, bring Junior home. Our armies of 11 million people disintegrated within weeks. Dean Rusk has a story about how this happened with all of our branches of the service. At the same time, these people who are traditionally isolationists, and that element is still in the population, turned around and did what? They created the Marshall Plan, NATO, the Berlin Airlift, you know, things of this nature. If you explain to Americans the problem in a very matter-of-fact way, you know, the fireside chat kind of thing that they used to have with Roosevelt, where he told you what was going on and then did something about it, whether you agreed with it or not. But he developed consensus. And I think Americans are the kind of people that once you explain the problem, they're practical-minded people. They'll do the right thing. At the end of the day, they'll do the right thing, but they have to be told. They have to be led by people who understand the dimensions of these issues. Because we've all got skin in the game, all of us. I mean, what happens in some labor dispute in Scotland impacts the BP station on Piedmont Road. And those things are beginning to dawn on people. And again, when it comes to the United States and its image, you know, the tsunami experience in Indonesia changed the Indonesians' attitude toward the United States, because our carriers were there with fresh water, and we had hospital ships and that sort of thing. And we're good at that. And we're the only power in the world who really has the capability of projecting power by air and sea to the extent that we do. So I think the United States is going into a whole new era here, where people are beginning to see the interrelationship between between these issues and themselves. And the population is changing. You know? I mean, when I first came to Georgia almost 50 years ago, you know, there were blacks and there were whites. And I remember the first day at Lenox Square, I saw an Asian. I turned to my wife and said, Julia, there's an Asian person over there. I couldn't believe it. Now, you know, 1 out of every 9 citizens living in Georgia is foreign born. We have the fastest growing Hispanic population, not the largest, but the fastest growing Hispanic population in the United States here. That's going to make a difference. And, you know, I mean, I've told this story before, I've got a niece whose name is Fiona O'Brien, and her mother is Chinese. You know, figure that out. So, you know, it's, and the great strength in America is not in the resources, the size of the country. It is in the ability of the country to attract men and women who want to affect change in their lives, you know. I mean, why did our relatives come here? And that's why Jose and Maria come, because they want to improve their lives. And these are the most dynamic people from their barrios, and they will make a contribution. They are making a contribution, just like the Germans, the Irish, the Italians beforehand. And so we have the ability to take people into this society and make them our own, and that creates the energy that nobody else in the world has. They just don't have it anywhere else, and that's an advantage.
Peter?
That's it. Very much.